So, do you think we can start now or wait for another 2 minutes?
How many people do we have on now?
17. But for the last week, we have about 90 to 100.
Yeah,
Mhm.
at the peak time. Um, let's see. I think it's fine to begin right on the hour, and then yeah, I think it's fine to go ahead and introduce.
Okay, so hello everyone, welcome to our Grant-o-thon Grant Writing Workshop 2024. So first, I want to do a brief introduction of our today's lecture. And today we're going to invite Professor Justin Tucker. Professor Justin Tucker is an infectious diseases physician and professor at UNC Chapel Hill and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he leads research exploring how crowdsourcing can enhance vaccine and diagnostics uptake in China and Nigeria. He has contributed to several World Health Organization's guidelines. He is a PI and MPI on NIH research grants totaling 30 million USD dollars. Tonight, he will give a lecture about the approach section of grant writing. So it's over to you, Dr. Tucker.
Thank you, Yusha. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thanks. It's great to be here with everyone today, and the approach section is really extremely important within an NIH grant. And so we wanted to break this up into 2 sessions. So I'm going to start talking about the approach section, and then next week we're going to hear from Dr. Nadia Samagudu. She's going to continue on the same theme. So what I will talk about, I'm going to first talk about why is the approach section important, and then I'll talk about the key components of an approach section. I'll talk a little bit about tables and how to create a beautiful, really strong table. I'll talk a little bit about figures. How do we make figures that resonate and sort of infographics. I'll talk briefly about videos and videos within an NIH grant application. And then finally, I'll touch very briefly on sex as a biological variable. So first, I'd like to start with a question. What are the most important things that should be included in the approach section of an NIH grant? If you could write your answer in the chat or in the Q&A box, that would be great. Go ahead and write in responses right now. I'm just going to give you about 30 more seconds, and then I'll go through. I'm starting to see a couple of responses in the Q&A section, and then also in the chat. That's fantastic. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Okay, thank you to everyone who responded, and you can see many of you wrote about methodology, which is exactly right. study setting, like what are the types of participants? That's an important piece of the approach section. The participant recruitment strategy, the data analysis plan, a clear description of your methods aligned with each aim is what Dr. Hartman says, and I completely agree. It's basically, if I were going to give you the money tomorrow, what would you do with it? Afisu Basiru, Dr. Basiru is saying methods and description of how the aim of the study will be accomplished, which is exactly right. And then in the chat box, there are a number of folks who discussed the research team. So who's the PI of the grant? Who are the co-investigators? Who are the key personnel? The study design, that's definitely an important part of the approach section. Alternative approaches. So Dr. Halauka is suggesting that it's not just what you're going to do, but if there's sort of a key decision point, it says the approach section will say, if X happens, if there's a certain thing that happens, then here's what I'm going to do to adjust my study design. And then statistical analyses, like sample size, how to demonstrate that the study has rigor and reproducibility. I completely agree with that. And Dr. Esteban is asking study design. Yes, definitely. That's a key part of it. And then the work plan, sort of how it's being implemented, the study rationale. I agree, that's a really important piece. Study recruitment. Dr. Sambo is suggesting ethical considerations, and that is a really interesting suggestion. If there are key ethical issues, you can sort of identify how you're going to deal with those ethical issues, but then you would want to signpost and basically say, for more details, see the human subjects research section of the grant. So I agree with you, sort of really important ethical considerations might be flagged, but there's a whole separate section that's on ethics and sort of which IRBs would review the protocol, those kinds of things. And let's see. Yes, so I think you've done a great job of outlining what are some of the really most important aspects. And I'm gonna keep going here. So my first piece of advice is imagine your reviewer is on a crowded airplane. You don't want to imagine them at a desk. You want to imagine that they're sort of cramped up. They're really, it's an economy ticket. They're at the back of the plane. They're not sipping wine and enjoying the day. They're sort of like tired. They're getting pinged on WhatsApp from a bunch of different directions. And really, the approach section, this is where you're going to describe in detail what you're proposing, including the preliminary data, the rationale, the analysis, and the sample size calculation. It's similar to a methods section within a research paper in terms of providing enough detail that you could actually do the work. And that's the beauty of the approach section, that after your grant is funded, this really becomes like the blueprint or the protocol if you're proposing a randomized control trial. And there are three different sort of general ways to organize this section. The first is a sequential approach if each aim has different study populations or data. And so that's sort of a relatively straightforward approach. The second would be an integrated approach if there's substantial overlap. So in other words, if your third aim is really just analyzing data collected from the RCT that you do in aim 2, then you might favor a more sort of integrated approach. And then the third way to do it is a hybrid that sort of partially goes through, is more sequential, or partially is more integrated. You want to avoid annoying your reviewers. And the sort of pet peeves of many reviewers, acronyms, and grant writers often put in unnecessary acronyms. And acronyms, my general sort of rule of thumb for an acronym is that if you have something that 10% of the people won't recognize, then that's too big of a risk for your review panel. You wouldn't want to use that kind of acronym. You also don't want, generally, you don't want repetition. I would put a caveat there that if there's a super important point, you may want to repeat that for emphasis. But generally speaking, trust that your reviewer is not going to need to have exactly the same sentence in more than one place. I do like to repeat the specific aims before the approach associated with each aim. Some folks don't do it this way, but it's more of a style point. Do not repeat items in the approach as a rule of thumb. And what you can do if you want to go over similar territory, you can cross-reference other parts of the grant. So I just mentioned before with ethics, you can highlight a few ethical issues and then say, for more details, see the human subjects research part of the grant. So what are the key components of an approach section? There's theory or a conceptual approach. And for many study sections, they're really going to want to see a strong theory section. How is this embedded in existing theories or conceptual ideas? Study team is also quite important. And the study team includes the PI or PIs, as well as key personnel, a brief description. Remember, you will have their NIH bio sketches as well. So the study team doesn't need to go into huge detail, but sort of a sentence for each key personnel can be helpful. And then it's usually organized along the specific aims. And so for each aim, you have a brief introduction that kind of goes through some of the key ideas. Then there's justification and feasibility, which provides a rationale and data from other groups, not from your own. Then preliminary data, where you give preliminary data about your intervention or your topic. That's things that you've published or your team has published. And then the design section, and usually the design section would have study sites. It would talk about key steps. There'd be a sample size calculation and power calculation. And for sample size, it's important to remember that there is a separate section on study design and sample size. So for kind of a for example, like an R21, you might have a brief sample size calculation and then refer to the separate section that's entirely on that. And then your measures, if you're giving, if you're collecting data from individuals and there are some key survey items, you might want to list the references for specific key survey items, as well as, have they been validated before in this population? The data analysis, this part is an opportunity to show the reader that you can not only do kind of the expected analyses, but then also do some secondary analyses that are exciting. The expected outcomes, this is really important for clinical trials, potential problems and alternatives. And I feel like this is what I like to think of as like bulletproofing the research grant, that oftentimes readers will come up with problems, and the potential problems section is a way for you to anticipate these problems and then say, you might think that this is going to be problematic because of X, but if X happens, then here's how I could adjust the study design or ensure that study would still be feasible and generate compelling data. And then sex is a biological variable. I'm going to get into this in more detail in just a few minutes. So reviewers, first I'll talk about theory. Reviewers really like to see a conceptual framework. This could be a formal theory, it could be an approach. You could weave together more than one theory or a conceptual framework. But you need to think about how they interrelate and how they would be used in your study. So you need to kind of bring these higher level conceptual ideas down to the level of your specific study. And expect this to be more carefully examined in qualitative studies and mixed methods research. So if you're going to use theory, then there'll be an expectation in these kinds of studies to get into more detail. The University of Washington has a very helpful website on picking an implementation science theory model or framework. You can see the URL here. And I think for dissemination and implementation studies, this is often a place where you need to kind of select at least one appropriate theory, model, or framework, and then go deeper. So the tables can help to break up the text and make things easier to digest, including a table title above and making sure that it can be interpreted on its own. Footnotes underneath the table are always a good thing. It's helpful to use consistent fonts and sizes. So if the whole grant is Arial 11, then I would generally use Arial 11 in the tables, in the figures as well. And my general take on shading and colors is to be simple. If you want to use colors, don't draw attention to them. Really make the science on the page the super exciting part. You shouldn't have to use the color to kind of draw attention or make things exciting. It should really be the science that gets people excited about your study. Figures can help explain new concepts, and it really can bring things to life. A flow chart in a clinical trial grant can be useful to map out the territory. And this is similar to the consort diagram in a trial paper. Many consider small photographs of the study team members, and this can be especially useful if their identity is relevant to the application. So sometimes the PIs will have like there were actual photographs in the grant. It obviously needs to be kind of small, but this is another way to break up the text. And if a figure doesn't really add value or have a clear message, then you should just delete it or revise it so that it's very clear. Videos can also provide valuable information that's not in the grant itself. You need to write about this in a cover letter if you are submitting a video, and you have to include an image still of the video in the research strategy. So you can't assume all the reviewers will access the video. Closed captioning is the best to increase understanding. And after the review group is listed, you would then contact the scientific review officer, the SRO. You're not supposed to include any hyperlinks to videos. And this actually, the same caveat about hyperlinks applies to the entire grant application. So an NIH grant application, including the bio sketches and the grant itself, is not supposed to include any hyperlinks. Sometimes they do allow you to put in URLs, but even that, it's sort of on a case-by-case basis. I would be cautious about including URLs. Sex is a biological variable. So sex is a biological classification encoded in DNA, whereas gender is socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions of men, women, and gender diverse people. There's more information about this specific topic online. You can see the brief video here, but this could be as simple as including a sentence or two in the research strategy in the approach section, and talking about if you have, say, an intervention and it's being you're testing this among both men and women, then how will analyses account for sex and or gender? It's really kind of being more explicit about sex and how you're going to examine sex within the context of your study. So now I'd like to ask a second question. And again, people can put responses into the chat box. So I'm going to give people 30 seconds or so just to look this over. True or false, cost is a valid reason for excluding females from inclusion in the study. If you could write your response, true or false. Good. Okay, so a chorus of falses. You are all correct. Cost is not an acceptable reason to exclude females from a study. There's scientifically justifiable reasons to exclude women. And so, for example, if you were proposing a study that focused on preventing HIV among men who have sex with men, then excluding women would make sense. But you would need to basically justify this on scientific grounds and say HIV is more common among men who have sex with men. There are unmet needs in terms of HIV services. Basically focus on the scientific rationale for either for including or excluding a group. So I'd like to thank our team. This is our SESH website. My email is below, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the approach section now. And then I'd also like to flag, like I mentioned before, Dr. Nadia will be picking up this topic further next week and going into more detail and sort of she'll be sharing her perspective on the approach section. So any questions, you can feel free to put them into the Q&A section or into the webinar chat. Okay, I see an initial question in the Q&A section from Dr. Halauka. How do you avoid redundancy with the significance and innovation sections? Good question. So within the innovation section of your grant, you're really describing sort of what's new and what's different. And you end up comparing, comparing your study to other work, whereas the significance section is more sort of providing rationale about the topic and situating this so that it's in a compelling context. And oftentimes the innovation section, I would say it's generally quite short, like a paragraph, not longer than like half a page. And the significance section is also tends to be, at least in my grants, I would say like a page. Both of them are relatively short. It's fine if you have the same idea within both of those sections, but I think the key point is that the innovation really needs to show how is your study new or different or breaking new ground. And the significance section, on the other hand, is more about giving the reader a context and giving them background information so that they can see that this is an important problem. So, and then I see a second question about how long should the approach section be? And if the overall grant, let's assume you're writing sort of an R21 style grant, then that would be 6 pages total for the research strategy. And within the research strategy, you would have usually maybe 1 page for significance, half a page for innovation, and then that would leave about 3.5 pages for the approach section. There's no hard, fast rules about the length of each of those sections. I'm just giving you a kind of rough approximation. And Yusha did share earlier an example of an R01 grant application, the same one that Juliet Iwulanmore had mentioned earlier on crowdsourcing. And there are other examples of funded NIH grants on the NIH website. So if you just Google sort of NIH sample grant applications and look for the NIH version, you should be able to find it. I see another question from Dr. Lee about explaining more about expectation of qualitative research and theoretical frameworks. Does that mean doing qualitative research about theory validation or adaptation? So when I mentioned theory and qualitative research, it's more like oftentimes there'll be a separate like subheading within the grant that's like conceptual framework or theory, and then you'd introduce the theory that you're interested in, and then later in data analysis you'd say, all right, here's how I'm going to use the theory that I told you about specifically in the analysis. So just to give you an example, if you're using the social ecological model, then your conceptual approach section might have a few sentences to say, what is this model? Why is this the right one to choose for your study? And then later in different, in either when you talk about data analysis, you can say, here's how we would use this specific social ecological model to analyze the data, that we might examine individual, family level, and social levels when we're analyzing the data. And it's to your point about doing qualitative research to validate a theory, if I wouldn't say that you have to do qualitative research to validate a theory or adapt it. I would say that if you're doing a study on gay men and you're using a participatory action research kind of theory, it might be helpful to look and see where has this participatory action research been used before in studies of gay men. So including a few references. And if it hasn't been used before, maybe that's innovation. And you could say, this theory that the participatory action research has never been used before, and that's why, and add that as sort of an additional point about the innovation. Good questions. Any further questions? Either you can put any final questions into the Q&A or into the webinar chat. I am a big fan of the research approach, the approach section, and I often feel like as a reviewer, this is the most common place where you'll see that a study will be dinged or there'll be critiques. It's the most common place where studies sort of falter, and I think it's an exciting for me. I always enjoy writing the approach section because I feel like it really drills down to detail and allows me to think, forces me to really be very specific about what I'm proposing. And ultimately, it's a good thing because then when you do the research, if you're writing a detailed approach section of your grant, it becomes easier to do the research. You've mapped it out, and you've even thought of some common things. Um, Another question from Dr. Halauka about, do you write the approach section first, or do you write the aims section? And this is a really good point. I generally will start with my specific aims page, and then I will go back, I'll start with the aims page. I'll write that, sort of get input from key part members of the team. Once that's cooked, or I feel like the general idea is there, then I'll go and inquire to a specific NIH program officer and say, is this grant idea within scope of your institute? Does this make sense? And then after that, then I'll go back and start writing out the approach section. So usually it would be aims, and then I like to focus on the approach right after the aims. So even before significance and innovation, because I feel like it's such a key part, and the significance and innovation can often be can sort of be a little bit easier. But there's not I think there are pluses and minuses of different writing sequences. It would be fine if you wanted to start with the aims and then go to significance and then innovation and approach. That would also be perfectly acceptable. Yeah, good. Let's see. We're about half past, a little after half past. Any other final questions before we leave? So thanks again. And this is, if anyone has specific questions, feel free to email me. And for those of you who are our next session will be from Dr. Nadia. She will be giving her presentation on the sort of another perspective on approach. Oh, sorry, one final question from the Q&A. Do we need to mention IRBs in the approach? Usually, my approach section wouldn't call out the ethical approvals. That would be very important for the human subjects research part of the grant, the HSR section. But for the approach section, you don't need to say which IRBs are going to be reviewing your proposal. If there's a key ethical consideration, for example, if you're enrolling minors in your study and you're going to be getting consent from parents and then minor assent, something like that might be good to kind of explicitly described, and then cross-reference the human subjects research section. But there's no need to say protection which IRBs would approve a study. Great. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.